This is Letter from America. Today's topic is forced anti-sanctions demonstrations, yet another complete flop. We live near Shirugwi. We were told to attend the funeral of President Mnangagwa's grandson who died last week. Then they changed the plans and told us to board buses to Harare for an anti-sanctions demonstration. We never planned to go there. Right now, here in Harare, far away from home, we have been demonstrating for hours. I don't even know what we are demonstrating against. We are hungry. We are thirsty. They did not give us food. They did not give us water. But there is some food and water under those tents. When we asked, we were told they were for top officials. These were the words of two Zimbabwean women who were forced to participate in the anti-sanctions demonstration. One of the women forced to participate in the anti-sanction demonstration said she needed water and food to take with her prescription pills. The irony of it all is that the top ZANU PF leaders were nowhere to be seen in these so-called demonstrations. The reality on the ground is the whole anti-sanction demonstration was a complete flop. ZANU had to resort to forcing people to attend rallies. And the tragedy of it all was, after the rallies, those people were abandoned. They were not given any food or water to drink, as the two women testified. They were left to fend for themselves after the event. Presumably, and according to ZANU PF Dhiziri paChinhoyi outfit, the people of Zimbabwe are being prevented from enjoying their human rights by these sanctions. ZANU PF is engaged in a circus of misinformation about sanctions. The United Kingdom reacted swiftly to the baseless claim that sanctions are hurting the Zimbabwean masses. The full text of the statement from the United Kingdom read, "Sanctions do not hurt Zimbabwean masses. The United Kingdom has targeted sanctions on 5 individuals for human rights violations and serious corruption, and an arms embargo and asset freeze on 1 entity. The 5 individuals are Owen Ncube, Isaac Moyo, Godwin Matanga, Anselm Sanyatwe, and Kudakwa Shetagwirei, and the entity is the Zimbabwe defense industry. Total trade between Zimbabwe and the UK for 2021 was $175 million. The United Kingdom also provides considerable development assistance, $114 million this year. This is assistance in support of Zimbabwe's own national development strategy. The United Kingdom wants to see Zimbabwe succeed. Anything that suggests that the United Kingdom wants to harm Zimbabwe or ordinary Zimbabweans is false. That was the statement from the United Kingdom. ZANU PF declared October 25 as an anti-sanctions day and expect people in SADC countries to go on demonstrations. The Mnangagwa regime managed to coerce SADC member countries into declaring this a SADC anti-sanctions day. Zimbabweans are expected to stage public demonstrations against sanctions. The target of these protests are the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom, which have maintained the sanctions against Zimbabwe. In the SADC countries, nobody demonstrated against these sanctions this week. All the economic problems Zimbabwe is facing are now being blamed fully and squarely on sanctions. The problem with this ZANU PF propaganda is that Zimbabweans are not being given the full context in which sanctions are applied. Zimbabweans have a right to full information on who imposed these sanctions, on whom they were imposed, why they were imposed, when they were imposed, and how exactly they have impacted the country. These sanctions or restrictive measures were imposed after Zimbabwe stopped repaying its external debts in 2000. Zimbabwe now owes more than 10 billion US dollars to multilateral financial institutions. The sanctions from the United States were imposed under the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, or ZIDERA, by Congress in 2001. ZIDERA was a direct response to two facts. One, Zimbabwe's default on loan repayments. And two, the systematic repression of human rights by the ZANU PF regime. ZIDERA was the latest in a series of sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe by multilateral agencies. In September 1999, the IMF suspended its support for economic adjustment and reform in Zimbabwe. In October 1999, the International Development Association suspended all structural adjustment loans, credits, and guarantees to the government of Zimbabwe. In May 2000, the International Development Association suspended all other new lending to the government of Zimbabwe. All of these sanctions came well before the ZIDERA was imposed in 2001. In other words, the United States was the last country to impose sanctions on Zimbabwe. Human rights organizations, as well as the United States Embassy in Harare, have highlighted significant human rights abuses in Zimbabwe. These abuses include unlawful or arbitrary killings of civilians, especially supporters of the CCC, the largest opposition party in the country, by security forces, torture and arbitrary detention by security forces, cases of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, harsh and life-threatening prison conditions, political prisoners or detainees, arbitrary and unlawful interference with privacy, serious problems with the independence of the judiciary, serious government restrictions on free press expression, press, and the internet, including violence, threats of violence, or unjustified arrests or prosecutions against journalists, censorship, site blocking, and the existence of criminal libel laws. substantial interference with the rights of peaceful assembly and freedom of association, restrictions on freedom of the movement or freedom of movement, restriction on political participation, widespread acts of corruption, lack of investigation and accountability for violence against women, crimes involving violence or threats of violence targeting women and girls. The embassy charged the government took very few steps to identify or investigate human rights violations. However, despite ZANU, the United States government continued to fund the humanitarian programs in Zimbabwe. Outgoing U.S. Ambassador to Zimbabwe, Brian Nichols, said on October 24, 2019, that the sanctions were targeted to 141 Zimbabweans who had engaged in corruption, had committed human rights abuses, and undermined Zimbabwe's democratic process. Blaming sanctions is a convenient scapegoat to distract the public from the real reasons behind Zimbabwe's economic challenges, namely corruption, economic mismanagement, and failure to respect human rights and uphold the rule of law, Brian Nichols said. He added that blaming sanctions is a convenient scapegoat to distract the public from the real reasons behind Zimbabwe's economic challenges, corruption, economic mismanagement, and failure to respect human rights and uphold the rule of law. Since 1980, the United States has contributed $3.2 billion in assistance to the Zimbabwean people, and the United States is the country's largest bilateral donor in health and humanitarian assistance to the Zimbabwean population. The level of corruption in Zimbabwe was and is still staggering. The Mnangagwa regime and ZANU PF cannot account for more than $1 billion that goes missing every year. According to the annual reports of the country's Auditor General, the most conspicuous example is the more than $2.8 billion missing from command agricultural subsidies. The money could have benefited up to 50% of the population who face food insecurity, and hospitals lack basic supplies, life-saving medicine, and medical equipment. In 2019, Clement Nyaletosi Vule, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, reported gross human rights violations in Zimbabwe after he had visited the country. In his preliminary findings, Mr. Vule gave reports of excessive, disproportionate, and lethal use of force against protesters through the use of tear gas, batons, and live ammunition. Vule wrote in his preliminary findings that he lamented the loss of lives due to excessive use of force against protesters, and urged the government to thoroughly investigate the incidents and prosecute those responsible. One example of this continuing use of force by ZANU was in Matopos just a few days ago, where ZANU PF thugs used the force of violence against supporters of the Triple C party. There is a Shona saying, Rine Manyanga Hariputirwe. It means the truth cannot be hidden forever. The truth in Zimbabwe is that human rights abuses continue. The anti-sanctions protests that will be stage managed by Mnangagwa's regime will not be effective or successful in hiding the truth that ZANU PF and the government of Zimbabwe do not respect or uphold democracy, human rights, civil liberties, and the rule of law. What Zidera required was for ZANU PF to respect the rule of law, human rights and democracy for all Zimbabweans as preconditions for the lifting of sanctions. And Zidera offered more than 20 million US dollars to help Zimbabwe meet these conditions. In 1974, the firebrand Catholic Bishop of the then Mutare, Bishop Donald Lamont, responded to the then Prime Minister Ian Smith, who had labeled ZANU and ZAPU freedom fighters as terrorists. The real terrorists, Bishop Lamont said, are the people who imposed white minority rule on the majority of the population. If Bishop Lamont were alive today, he would say the real sanctions in Zimbabwe are the human rights abuses, corruption, arbitrary arrests inflicted by the ZANU PF on the people of Zimbabwe. Bishop Lamont would say it's ZANU PF that has imposed the sanctions against the people of Zimbabwe. The mindless campaign to lift sanctions against Mnangagwa and ZANU PF, which had robbed in SADC, has, as I said again, hit rock bottom. This anti-sanctions campaign is now a mangled scrap heap after both the United States and the European Union stated that sanctions will stay until Mnangagwa and his Dhiziri paChinhoyi gang respect the restoration of rule of law and human rights in Zimbabwe. That is the position of the United States and the European Union to this day, and it will continue to be that until ZANU PF deals with corruption and deals with autocratic rule and restores the rule of law and human rights in Zimbabwe. The United States and the European Union countries have stressed that the sanctions are not against Zimbabwe as a country, but targeted at individuals in this Dhiziri paChinhoyi regime. In 2021, the United States provided over 317 million US dollars in bilateral assistance to support democracy and governance, agriculture, and health programming. In addition, the United States provided 51 million US dollars in humanitarian assistance to Zimbabwe. And that clearly shows that the so-called sanctions are not intended to harm Zimbabwe or the Zimbabweans. And as has been stated before, the United States remains the largest provider of health and humanitarian assistance, including U.S. President's Emergency Fund for AIDS relief, food assistance, and disaster relief to the people of Zimbabwe. The demonstrations by human rights activists against Mnangagwa at the United Nations recently were seen and heard through the social media networks far and wide. They brought to the attention of the international community the plight of the Zimbabweans who are groaning under the iron heel of ZANU PF Mnangagwa's regime's fascist dictatorship. Zimbabweans have never ever enjoyed real freedom and democracy under the Mugabe Mnangagwa dictatorship. Their socio-economic situation is the same, although some would say worse than during the Ian Smith settler colonial Rhodesia. Biden, at a meeting with the South African President Ramaphosa, said that he sympathized with South Africa's migration problem, but he disagreed strongly with Ramaphosa that sanctions were causing problems, economic problems for the region. And an official who was with President Biden at the meeting with Ramaphosa said Biden made it clear that the issue is the behavior of the government of Zimbabwe. He said the United States is not seeking a regime change, but is concerned about the increasingly repressive environment inside Zimbabwe. The United States Ambassador to South Africa, Ruben Brigetti, said during a News 24 interview that the United States would be open to a change in sanctions regime if there was a change in the repressive political environment inside Zimbabwe. And that is not news, he said. That is the US law, and it is clear. In other words, sanctions will not be removed until there is a clear change in the repressive political environment inside Zimbabwe. The ZANU PF propagandists were singing victory songs that the United States and Europe had now seen the light. They said the United States had extended an invitation to Mnangagwa to attend and participate in the US-Africa Summit scheduled for December in Washington, D.C. They also argued that IMF had praised Zimbabwe's economic policies. But the truth is the IMF made it clear it was not going to extend any new loans to Zimbabwe. So, all that howling against sanctions and the so-called anti-sanctions day in October will only please Mnangagwa and the Dhiziri paChinhoyi outfit. They are but nothing but hot blowing wind. No one else is listening to them. Anti-sanctions marches planned in SADC countries have been a remarkable flop. The US has made it clear that as long as the Dhiziri paChinhoyi regime of ZANU PF and Mnangagwa does not respect the rule of law and basic human rights, sanctions will not be renewed. It has become increasingly evident that Mnangagwa, the late Mugabe, and ZANU PF are using sanctions as the cause of the country's economic meltdown. His propaganda always describes the sanctions as illegal. But are they? The only hopeful factor is that even many top ZANU PF officials now privately accept that sanctions are the cause of they are not the cause of the economic malaise in Zimbabwe. Top ZANU PF officials now accept that is not sanctions that is hurting the economic malaise in Zimbabwe. There is a recording taking place. There's a recorded file, audio on the internet, quoting Zimbabwe's ambassador to Mozambique, Victor Matematanda, in which he lays out the case against ZANU PF. And in that recorded video, it is very clear that there is a great deal of dissatisfaction within the ranks of ZANU PF itself. A number of diplomats and officials from the United States and European Union have repeatedly told Mnangagwa that the economic problems for Zimbabwe are not caused by sanctions, but they are caused by economic mismanagement. Former United States Ambassador to Zimbabwe, Brian Nichols, said the Zimbabwe government should implement the necessary reforms in order for America to lift the targeted sanctions imposed on some ZANU PF members over alleged corruption and human rights violations. The government of Zimbabwe would be better served by focusing on its efforts on implementing reforms that it campaigned on. That is to say, deepening democracy, combating corruption, increasing respect for human rights, and opening up the economy for transparent trade and investment. Those are things that will make the average Zimbabwean's lives better. Ambassador Nichols said America has been pressing the Zimbabwean government to implement these necessary reforms. What boggles the mind is that Zimbabwe is being asked to respect human rights and the rule of law as a condition for the lifting of sanctions. Nothing could be simpler than this requirement. As a matter of fact, when the US Congress passed the ZDERA in 2002, it included more than $20 million to help Zimbabwe return to the rule of law and respect basic human rights.
This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Thank you for listening. This concludes today's broadcast of Letter from America, a weekly in-depth